Today here in the studio, we have Hamel. Uh, Everyone knows Hamel, so he needs no introduction, but he's a walking legend in the machine learning MLOps world. Would this be correct, Hamel? Would you say?
I am whatever I am to you, Reddick. So
To me, you
it's
are.
all
To me, you
whatever
are.
is in your mind. That's the reality
Okay, so
for
to me,
you.
you are that, and even more. Um, Beautiful. So we got on the call because of a tweet that I wrote, and we'll see if we can add the tweet on screen somewhere here. And what was in the tweet? It was on Docker, and it was
Yeah,
a
let
little
me
bit
see.
contentious.
It was a little
It
bit
was a little bit
spicy. Should I read the tweet?
spicy. Yeah, please do.
Okay. So Reddick says, what does Docker give you as a data scientist? Does it give you reproducibility? Ease of switching between environments? Anything else? I keep meeting people that are gaslighted into using Docker where it doesn't make any sense in their situation. I'm thinking about writing about this. And then
Yes.
I replied with just in jest, really, that I'm happy to fight you if you like. And then we decided to jump in the ring, so to speak, the friendly ring of this
here,
of this conversation.
and here we are. Yes, exactly. So Hamel, maybe before I share my pains that have accompanied me for years now, uh, please tell me, why should a data scientist know Docker or use Docker in the first place? How is it used?
Yeah, so in general, like even thinking about things that are not machine learning, when we talk about deploying applications, meaning uh, shipping code that needs to run outside your laptop to some system. It can be an orchestration system, some kind of pipeline, um, even if it can be a web app, whatever it is. The kind of modern way to do that, or the way that is becoming more and more popular, is to package that code and package that code in some kind of container technology. It can, Docker is the most popular container technology at the moment. And so the reason that it touches the ML world is a lot of that same infrastructure is used for the same purpose of deploying machine learning code alongside
Mhm.
various applications that you might have in your technology stack. And so a lot of times, if you are tasked with deploying your code, which often data scientists are, and this is a part of the conversation of what is your role? If your role involves shipping some code you have, then often you need to be at least aware of Docker because you might have to package your code inside that. And if you don't have to directly use Docker, a lot of times, there's some abstractions. Like let's say, for example, Metaflow. Metaflow allows you to you don't have to use Docker if you don't need to, but there are some edge cases where you might need to. So like, for example, in Metaflow and a lot of others, you can just use a decorator that says like a Conda decorator, kind of,
Mhm.
something that's very friendly to a data scientist that specifies all the packages. And behind the scenes, it will Dockerize things and it will deploy that and it will run that. But sometimes that doesn't quite work. There are edge
Uh-huh.
cases where, you want something very specific to happen. So you need a very specific operating system, very specific other dependencies outside Python. And solving for that sometimes is like a lot easier to reach for Docker. Let's say you don't want to build that yourself, because Conda allows you to also include things outside Python. But sometimes, you know, if you're using some tool or some package or something else from a vendor, like NVIDIA,
Mhm.
some of their paved paths. Like if you're trying to say, okay, like, use this tool, on their documentation, they'll give you the NVIDIA Docker image, and they'll say use NVIDIA Docker, easiest way to do this. So from a practical perspective, it's very useful to be able to at least be okay with using Docker, because sometimes that is the easy path, so to speak, when you're trying to deploy your code or even sometimes run code or even play with tools. So that's
But
kind of, yeah.
no, that's very interesting. I have a personal horror story because that's how I got into Docker, where I had a web app that I wanted to deploy. I read a book on deploying Rails applications using Docker, and then this miraculous world, this rabbit hole opened up to me. And at that point, after I went through that process, I thought that I probably would be better off if I used FTP to just copy my code to the server. Just the complexity of Docker Compose, and then once you ship stuff into like this, you probably want your dev environment to also be using Docker, right? That makes sense. And with web apps, like how do you test stuff inside a Docker container where some of the tests require firing up a browser? So regardless, but this is my horror story from the past. Right now, I'm a machine learning engineer, maybe researcher at times, or definitely a data scientist. And what I hear over and over again, data scientists should use Docker. There's a guy, they go online and they see how to become a data scientist. Use Docker, learn SQL. It's essentially similarly useful advice. That's at least my perspective. So you covered one use case that is right. If you're working at a large corporation and you're deploying your things in this very advanced environment that supports Docker, then yes, if you want to survive, you have to learn how to use Docker. When I joined NVIDIA, thankfully, I already had suffered a lot through Docker in the past. So I wrote my own scripts to use Docker for what I need to do at work, because I would absolutely hate it if I had to go via the command line over and over again. It's so tedious, so painful. Right. So based on what you said, deployment is the only reasonable use case for using Docker in the machine learning world. Would that be the correct statement?
No, I didn't say that. I agree with you that, okay, so, Docker, even Kubernetes, and a lot of other tools in technology they're about collaborating with, those tools are born out of this need to collaborate with a large number of people, which, happens to correlate also with large companies. And so if you're working by yourself, there's absolutely no need. If you're in control of everything, and let's say you want to just launch on a VM, there's no need to use all this stuff. Like I would not use this. I would not use it. They're like, why?
Beautiful. I will record it, play it in the loop every morning for myself at least 50 times to recover some of my sanity. Yes, if you're a individual practitioner, data scientist, or are working at a company where the company may employ 150 people, whatever, but there are 3 people on your team, then it might be a little bit like a scenario with microservices, right? There used to be a time where everyone tried to adopt microservices, even if it was not solving the problem that you and your organization was having. And that came at a very steep price, because microservices add this extra layer of separation, and it makes everything much more complex.
Yeah. One thing this is like really good to realize is that tools are just about they're just as much about organizations matching an org structure than they are about tools. So like microservices is not, I mean, you can get into academic debate if microservices were good, but in some ways it was just something to match an org structure. That's like one view that people have of microservices. It's like some reality of companies, let's say. But I would say, like, even in very small situations, like even in small teams, like teams of 2 or 3 people, I found it a lot easier to use Docker in certain situations. Like, I'm not talking about training model, well, not directly like training models in the way you would think. Like, for example, we wanted a common environment that had a lot of software in it, like VS Code, Jupyter notebooks, all kinds of other stuff. It had to be like, special. It had to be a very specific version of CUDA, work on, a specific operating system, all this stuff. And we didn't want people to fiddle with it too much. We just wanted to be able to spin up very fast. And so Docker was the best way to distribute that starting point for people, even on VMs. Like say, okay, look, if you're going to start a VM, just run this Docker container and then develop inside that. And then obviously from inside the Docker container, they'll use Conda and pip and do whatever. It's not like you're locked in. It's just the starting point, like that we would use to bootstrap people. And I think that was useful. That like made it to where people could, they didn't have to start from scratch every time, or they would, they could start quickly, let's say, in a way that is easy to distribute.
But probably the data also lived somewhere, on some server or some other
database.
share,
Yes,
some database. So this is not a scenario that 99.98% data scientists encounter in their work, right? This is again large organization, very modern, that has adopted some of those paradigms already.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting comment. Like, I don't know how to describe the percentage on this. Like, it would be interesting. I mean, I would say a lot of data scientists work somewhere where the data isn't a database, you would think, but maybe not. I mean, I would say hopefully they do if they are working for a company, because like, I mean, if they're not in a database, then that's, maybe a red flag that they're not ready for a data scientist. Hopefully data scientists, usually data scientists are not the first people on the ground in the company. Usually it's application engineers, other people, and they build something that collects data, that does something in the real world that happens to collect data. And then at some later point, data scientists come in. And at that point, there's already some infrastructure around. But also I do know that there's also lots of other data scientists. I mean, yeah. So I hope that data scientists are in that regime. I do know, and I have been part of situations where data science is just thrown in without anything. And I hope that's not 99.8%. I would like to think that that's the minority, but I don't know.
Maybe it's 99.97. I'm not sure, let's be optimistic here. But you're essentially describing companies that started within last 10, 15 years when this technology existed. And there's this vast majority of large companies, where things still happen in spreadsheets. And this is the world that many data scientists operate in. I feel so, at least. That's my observation. I would imagine. And suddenly you have somebody who is a college graduate, or who wants to become a data scientist, and they go online and they hear all those discussions between a guy who's working at Amazon and another guy who's working at Meta. And Docker, you should use Docker because this and this. And this whole movement starts like with microservices, and it will run its course for next couple of years. How it was with microservices. So many companies that are not internet scale companies had to pay enormous price in terms of lost productivity for adopting this completely unsuited paradigm to their situation. And I feel that this is my personal opinion, just drawing parallels, that while Docker maybe can deliver more value to all organizations than such a thing as microservices, maybe it really is not the first thing you should be learning when you're trying to improve your machine learning skills.
No, so you said earlier something about SQL and Docker. I would say on the hierarchy of needs, SQL is probably the biggest bang for, like, nothing compares to things like SQL, maybe Excel. I mean,
Mhm.
these are two, I would say, unsexy technologies, but they're probably the most useful technologies almost everywhere that you can think of. I wouldn't put Docker in the same league as that like as a data scientist. Nowhere close.
And if you know such a thing as Excel, or you can create visualizations or things like that, you can deliver real business value, and you can find employment, or opportunities at many places. Whereas if you say you're using Docker, it already precludes you from many conversations, because I mean, maybe not precludes you, but yeah, you're targeting this narrow but growing, very attractive field of modern companies, right? Big tech that many people
Yeah,
are.
I mean, like, so it also is like it's also probably useful to talk about what do we mean by data scientist. Like, okay, we're talking about someone who does ad hoc analyses, reporting, dashboard, visualization. I don't think that Docker doesn't seem like it's even necessary in that regime. Machine learning, you kind of get more towards this, you more commonly get into the situation where you're trying to deploy some software. And so it comes down to like, how does your company, like, what's the most reasonable thing to do at your company? Is it to, like, if you're the only person, there is no infrastructure for deploying anything, or let's say it's written in COBOL or something, which, as you said, like, there's a lot of old companies, then maybe it does make sense for you to just, keep it simple. Keep it
Mhm.
simple. Yeah. And like,
Yep.
yeah, just because like Google uses it doesn't mean that it's a good idea. That means like most of the time, I won't say most of the time, but a lot of the time, it's a bad idea to use what Google is using. It will
Yes,
it will destroy you.
yes, exactly. That's the right way to look at things. If a large company is using something, it's very unlikely that it will translate to vastly different setting.
Yeah. But I will say, like, okay, I mean, I probably the people who are saying, okay, you should learn Docker, those are people that are coming from the standpoint of, if you want to if you want to have the skills of deploying machine learning in a quote modern setting, then it's absolutely necessary in most situations. Or you
Okay,
will be
that's
asked about it either way. So you should know,
mhm.
from a practical perspective, you should know about it if you want to get a job, or most likely from operating within the constraints of the technology, it will just make your life much easier. So you should.
If deployment is a component of your job.
Yeah.
That,
And so
that is the
that's
thing.
the deployment component of your job. So that is an interesting sentence. Like, to say that you don't deploy your code is probably viewed as if you said to somebody, if you were walking down the street in San Francisco, you met a developer and you say, hey, you don't deploy your code, probably get really defended, even though it's totally okay for that person not to deploy their code. Maybe they have some, maybe they're doing something that doesn't make sense to deploy their code. And so people don't like to admit they're not deploying their code, including organizations don't like to admit that they're not deploying code. And so even if you're not deploying code, there's a strong pretense or a strong kind of desire to act like you are, or you're going to soon.
Mhm.
And so in that sense, um, you know, yeah, like, then that's when, people want to learn these technologies.
So I absolutely love the emphasis on deploying your models, right? I think it comes from Metaflow, where if a model that is not deployed is essentially, not as valuable in some sense. This is not wasted work, but it's sort of like in production, you have things that you ship over to customers and some don't pass the quality control. It's a waste in that sense, right? If your work doesn't end up being deployed. So I completely get that sentiment. I think it's awesome to the extent I understand and can relate. But I'm thinking, we sort of accepted that Docker is the right way to deploy your code, or the way to deploy your code. But is this really true for smaller organizations? I keep thinking about things like a simple API endpoint, or fast API, or whatever their API, or even SageMaker or Vortex. These are vastly simpler to get into, right?
Absolutely. Like, I mean, so okay, if you're going to deploy an application, it's of course the case that you can do it without Docker. You can use like a Lambda, basically a serverless function that is, you only have to touch the programming language that you want. Like you can just use JavaScript, or you can just use Python, or you can just use whatever. Docker is, but interestingly, like a lot of these serverless services, they allow Docker as an escape hatch in the superset of, okay, like if something, goes wrong, or you can't quite fit in this paradigm, and, you want other kinds of dependencies that are hard to accommodate, then they kind of, that is the popular path. That's like the escape hatch, so to speak, even in those things. So, but, like the smaller you are, in the more narrow problem you're working on, like if it's, of course, is the case by yourself, like it's quite likely that you don't have to. And I mean, it's not like, yeah, a lot of people could successfully deploy stuff without Docker, potentially. So it's not like this maximalist thing, like if you don't do it, if you don't know it, there's no way in hell you could deploy something. That's absolutely not true.
So even that perception is not right. So we managed to shred this one to pieces as well. Wonderful. Hamel, you've helped me demystify the world of MLOps and data science, and helped me understand a little bit what Docker is, what Docker isn't. I got a chance to pour out some of my pain. There's way more pain when it comes to Docker. For example, how hard it is to get started with it, because even mounting your data, you can do it in two ways, and there's no way you can understand from the documentation why one way
so
is better
I don't
from
know
the
if you've
other.
seen it. I have a blog post on the subject.
Oh, really?
Yeah, this is Google
Cool.
Hamel Docker. What do you see?
Google Hamel Docker. All right, everyone, whoever is with us and lasted till the end of the conversation, please Google Hamel Docker. Google Hamel Docker. I have even a better idea. We will include a link in the description of this video. That's how the real professionals do it.
And so in that blog post, I'd make it, I think, pretty easy to understand. And I give you one way of doing everything. And I list all the common commands, and with like red boxes around them, like explaining the different parts, what they do. And I actually go back to this same blog post all the time. Like, and I'm like, oh, what did I do in this thing? I just go to the blog post.
Beautiful.
So
I love it.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I want as a new user to a technology. I want one way of doing something and somebody to tell me what I should do. Where when I was learning Docker, I would try to read the documentation. And yeah, there are multiple ways of doing the same thing, or specifying the command, in this funny way. Yeah, I mean, it's just a rabbit hole for anyone who wants to go down that path. So Hamel, that will be invaluable. Well, I guess
I think you should still learn it, though. That's what my opinion, my fleeting thought is. You should.
Okay.
It's good to learn. I don't think it's the most urgent thing to learn, but I think it's good to learn. But I'm the kind of person that thinks like a lot of things are good to learn. So, yeah.
I like learning as well, but I like learning useful things. And if I hear that a person wants to get started with Kaggle and they say, Radek, show me how to use Docker for that. Or, somebody is running on a project on their own or working for a company and they're the only person training the model and doing something with it, not even serving it, because often the outcome is some analysis or some insights or maybe proof of concept.
Right.
And if for that they want to separate themselves from their code through the layer that Docker is and deal
No, it
with
doesn't make
all
sense.
the
It doesn't make any
deal
sense.
with
It's
all
kind
the
of
fun stuff.
it's kind of a
Let me
meme at
pour
that
out.
point.
This is a therapy session for me. So let all the pain flow. You have to deal with mounting your data. Oh, God forbid you save something from the Docker container and then have to deal with permissions. Oh, or maybe you exec into the Docker container and then you accidentally run a Git command. Oh no, you're in trouble, and then you have to be fixing all of that. So yes, if you don't know why you need Docker, then my recommendation would be stay away from it. Run away, scream fire. Only once you know why you need Docker, only then, and you have a really good reason for that, only then you should reach out for this very powerful, but also very tricky to use tool, especially if you don't have somebody like Hamel showing you the ropes. So if you are subjected to Docker because of your life choices, then please read Hamel's blog post. It's the only thing that can save you. And maybe you will have a fewer, gray hair than I do, which I wish everyone.
I feel like there's some more color to the story. Like someone came at you about Docker in a Kaggle competition or something.
No.
Terrorized you.
Unfortunately, there is no story. I have been terrorized by Docker, and I invested really a lot of energy into learning Docker, and now I feel confident in using Docker, and that's very useful at my work, for example, because I have to use Docker every day for various things. But I just feel sorry to my past self that all the time I invested into doing things that could have been handled in a better way. I'm like the one-person startup that adopted the microservices architecture and woke up, 12 months later and understood that the mighty monolith is the right abstraction for me. Beautiful.
Makes sense. No, that sounds good.
Amal, thank you so
nice
much
to
for
see
the
you.
therapy session. Thank you so much for the therapy session. Yes, and nice seeing you too. Very nice seeing you too, actually. Great conversation.
Yeah. All right. Sounds good, man.
Thank you, my friend. See you soon.
Yeah.
Take care.
See ya. Yeah.